That's right. We have our next guest, Dr. Sal Mercogliano, a favorite here at FreightWaves TV. We know him as a maritime expert, but with the issues going on in the Northeast with gas and diesel, there are some maritime issues brewing, especially with the with the Jones Act. Sal, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. Good to be with you again, Anthony. So obviously we're seeing diesel shortages up in the Northeast. And a lot of that had to do with speculation in the market back in March and April when diesel fuel was at a really high price over in Europe. And we saw really an unprecedented event. We saw tankers come into the New York area and actually pull diesel fuel out of the area, haul it across to feed into the European market. What that means is there's a diesel shortage that we've appeared in the Northeast. And this is really due to two things. One of them is the production of diesel in the Northeast is down 50% from where it was a decade ago. That has to do with accidents in refineries and the closing down of refineries. But the other limitation you have on the distribution of diesel fuel to the Northeast is two things. One, the Colonial Pipeline takes you about 14 days to haul fuel through the pipeline. And so there's a lot of question about, do you want to displace gasoline and put diesel into the pipeline? And the other is the availability of tankers. Because of hauling diesel from the Gulf of Mexico to the Northeast part of the United States, those have to be in what's called Jones Act tankers. These are tankers that are U.S. flagged, U.S. owned, U.S. built, and U.S. crewed. And there's a finite number of those tankers available. Now, they are available. There are tankers that can perform this mission. But right now, what you're seeing is some of these oil companies that have driven down the stock in Northeast are saying that they want to get a waiver to bring in foreign ships because their perception is the foreign ships would be cheaper than the American ships, although I doubt that right now based on the market demand for smaller tankers.
So cheaper is one thing, but faster would also be the other thing, correct? Are we talking about speed as a factor of choosing whether to use those Jones Act flagships, U.S. flagships versus foreign carriers? Because I assume that it would take way longer to get those foreign carriers into U.S. waters and get those moved up, right? Rather than just using the capacity that already exists here.
Right. What some of the carriers want to do and what some of the oil companies want to do is they're coming in and maybe they're dumping refined oil. We have a very unique problem in the United States in that we produce almost as much oil as we need, but we lack the refinery capacity. We haven't built a new refinery in the United States since 1977. We've added on to refineries, but our refining capacity, particularly for new oil, fracking oil, is really not equal to what it has been with older heavier oil. And so you get a weird position where we're actually exporting oil and importing oil into the U.S. at the same time. And Jones Act tankers are pre-positioned and stationed along the coast. They're along the Gulf Coast. They're along the East Coast. They're ready to be used. But what ocean carriers and a lot of the big oil companies want to do is use their tankers that may be doing a lift of opportunity, come in, pick up a load for 2 to 3 days, haul it from the Gulf of Mexico up to the West Coast or up to the East Coast and use it. And they're trying to get more cargo in their vessels. And so that's one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of screaming about the Jones Act. This happens every time there's a shortage, a hurricane, a shutdown in the Colonial Pipeline. We hear these calls for Jones Act waivers.
And shifting gears here, you see a nightmare scenario potentially playing out, especially with diesel and the Russia-Ukraine crisis going on right now. Can you jump into that?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the Black Sea is creating a whole new area of potential concern. We're talking about a potential food crisis coming out with the inability of Ukraine to get their grain out. Now, one of the things we've seen recently is Ukraine has shifted, moving their grain down to the Danube River on ports that still are within Ukrainian hands, ports like Rene and Izmail, very small ports. And what we've seen is this huge group of bulkers, very small coastal bulkers, appear off the Danube River, just 15 miles away from what you see in the news all the time, Snake Island. And one of the reasons that the Ukrainians have been suppressing that island is they're trying to get those bulk ships out. But we've seen stories recently of Russian bulkers taking out stolen Ukrainian wheat. There was just a story of a Russian bulk ship that tried to take wheat to Egypt. The Ukrainians protested against it, and that vessel diverted to Syria to offload. The fear here is that if the Russians target those vessels that are loading Ukrainian wheat off the Danube River on the western side of the Black Sea, the Ukrainians may retaliate. We've seen the effectiveness of the Ukrainians in hitting Russian ships in the port of Berdansk. They sank the flagship of the Russian fleet, the Moskva. What happens if they start targeting vessels coming out of Russia? These could be grain and oil ships coming from the pipeline system in the Central Asia. And any sort of attack like that will send food and fuel prices skyrocketing as you launch these styles of attacks.
So, Sal, how close are we to this humanitarian crisis level where obviously we've got the displacement of the Ukrainian people, we've got them seeking refuge in neighboring countries, but how close are we to having this food now becoming true humanitarian crisis for them? That was one of the things that we talked about when the war first started.
Right. Well, you have the head of the UN Food Administration saying that we're at that point. If we don't act very soon, very quickly, there's going to be food shortages in key areas. Now, your viewers in the United States don't have to worry about really food shortages. But what the concern here is in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, where food is not going to be able to get in. Now, there was a hope that, for example, India, which was having a record yield of grain, could fill in the gap. The problem with India was twofold. Number one, they've had a huge heat wave that has now nullified any gains they had in their wheat. The second is India doesn't have the ports to really get that wheat out in any large measures. And what we're seeing here really isn't a decrease in the amount of food around the world, but what we're seeing is a decrease in the ability to transport the food by ships. You can see how quickly this can be displaced by just looking at what happened with baby food when you shut down one plant and you have basically a cascade effect down the supply chain.
And Sal, another big topic, of course, is Shanghai. With that scenario, we're looking at Shanghai reopening potentially soon. What does that look like? How long is it taking for it to ease, and what can we kind of expect in the coming weeks here?
Sure. So I've been talking to a mariner on board a ship, the President Wilson, which has been stuck in Shanghai since mid-March. In mid-March, the workers walked off and didn't come back, and they're only now slowly starting to come back on board. So we're seeing Shanghai slowly open up. Again, the port's been open. We've seen vessels moving. The problem is containers and trucks and trains coming in and out of that area have been slow, which means that we're not getting the full loads out of the ports. And, we're getting ready for really an issue here where it's going to be a kind of cascade of issues all come at the same time. These ports are going to open, which means we're going to see this flood of vessels coming out. We still have 30 vessels off LA and Long Beach, for example. We see the dwell time in containers in the port of LA increasing, not decreasing. We're seeing delays getting through the Panama Canal because a lot of shippers are now diverting to the East Coast. You just did that report where we're seeing in the month of April, East Coast is up 18.7% over last year, while the West Coast is down almost 4%. And we're talking about a 13 to 7 day delay to get through the Panama Canal from the Pacific to the Atlantic right now. That's only going to increase as more vessels come across. And then just to throw something else into this, like there's not enough. You've got the ILWU contract renegotiations that just started last week, and their contract ends the end of June.
So we've got just a little bit over a month before that next piece of the puzzle can either fit right in or completely mess everything up. So Sal, thank you for joining us today. Great to have you as always. We'll talk to you again soon.
Wish the news was better, but I'm happy to be with you guys.
Don't we all? We always wish our news was a little bit better, right, Anthony?
Especially with weather.
Yeah, well, the weather's been pretty good here in the South. It's just been hot, but we'll talk about that a little bit later.
I'll take the heat. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be right back with more FreightWaves Now.